It's went back.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another IAPC&M CPD conference call. I'm Dawn Campbell, your host, and as usual, I'm joined by David Monroe-Jones, who is Acting Head of Accreditation. Absolutely key to this series of webinars. Hello, David, as it's designed to help new applicants transition through their assessment call as smoothly as possible. Today in the hot seat, we have Fayad Khalif. Hello, Fayad.
Hello everyone.
Fayad is an accredited master coach based in Dubai. He's a corporate professional with wide-ranging experience and has actually been honored with several government awards for contributions to the UAE society. So we're very honored to have you with us today. And the topic for today's webinar is direct communication. So perhaps, David, you would like to kick off, please, as head of accreditation, and just talk us through what that actually means in terms of a capability for a new coach.
Okay, so the definition that we use within the capability model for direct communication is the ability to communicate effectively by using appropriate and clear language that the client can understand, make use of the information and the feedback that's provided. So there are really three elements to the communication. One is the communication from the coach to the client. The second part of that is dealing with the communication that comes from the client back to the coach. And then in between all of that is how the coach deals with that information and how they provide feedback. So it's a little bit, it's surprisingly more complex than you might first give credit to.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds very obvious when you think about direct communication, but there's obviously a lot of components you're looking for when you're assessing. What, if anything, would you like to add to that, Fayad, please?
Yeah, I kind of agree with David. It's not one way. I could say there's two elements and factors when it comes to communication. And as I said, I really want to simplify the whole concept because it seems the concept is being exaggerated somehow, or it's being misleaded to somehow. Communication is being, it's not only, I always have a statement as not every excellent communicator has an excellent communication skills. Why is that? Because a communication is not about you sending a message to a receiver. It's also about the ability that you also could receive a message from someone else as a receiver from a sender. So basically it's two ways. And as David mentioned, is it's not only you sending a message, but it's also the ability that you could also observe a new message. And this is one of the conflicts. Maybe there are a couple of people, they might be an amazing public speakers, but once that you open a conversation with them, you feel there is something either is wrong or it's not matching, or you're not convinced more than you were not even convinced. So yeah, I think there's two ways to, or two things to keep in mind. Is not only you sending a message, it's also about you receiving the message itself.
I mean, certainly that encompasses a lot of the previous discussions that we've had around questioning technique, listening, and building rapport, obviously. So if we break it down into some of the components, David, what are you looking for from your team of assessors when they're assessing coaches?
I think one of the first things is that it's the clarity of the communication. And as we go through this conversation, so we can pick up on some of the more intricate details of that. But what you don't want is a situation where the client is either struggling to understand what the coach is on about, or in the way that they ask questions. And you're right. So there's not even just a tentative link. There's a direct link back to all of the other sort of capability areas that we've already looked at, and also the ones that are coming up, that they're clear in their communication. So the client isn't going, okay, that sounded great, I've got no idea what you're on about. So what we look for within that is two of the C's, clarity and conciseness. so that they're clear in what they state or what they ask or what they say, and it's concise enough that the client can then go away and do something about it. And probably the third thing that I would add, and I'm sure we'll come on to this in a bit more detail, is that the client uses their own language and the coach picks up on that. So if a client is using a specific term, then the coach will pick up on that and not just use like a term that they're familiar with. So there's an understanding of the language specific to the client.
And that's what we mean by mirroring back, isn't it?
Mm.
And clean language. So not, if the client says, I'm concerned about such and such, the coach doesn't then go and say, what are you angry about? It's not putting words in their mouth.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And I think
Sorry, David.
No, I was just going to agree with that just before Fayad speaks, that it's very easy to sort of make assumptions, and that example that you gave is one that comes up surprisingly more often than you might imagine. That if a client says something, that catching yourself making either an assumption or a presumption is really important, because if you're unsure, the general rule is, if in doubt, there is no doubt, so therefore ask. And it may be that, if using concerned, just going back to that, it may be that, the coach, as you say, might use the wrong term and say, oh, well, what are you angry about? Which probably makes, as you say, the client more concerned now because the coach isn't using the same language. But also, if the coach is unsure what the client means by being concerned, then they'll go back on that as well and say, okay, when you say that you're concerned, what do you mean by that? So there's opportunity for deeper exploration if it's appropriate, depending upon the context and what's gone on before that.
Mm. And that's such a great question. What do you mean by that? Because we all have different interpretations of the same words.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Fayad.
Yeah, I totally agree with you guys. I think the personalization approach is very important, the coaching and even in the mentoring aspect, because you can't use the same communication style with everyone. It differs from someone to someone based on their background, based on their culture, education, and so on. So even at the same situation, you can't use them. So it's very important that the coach and mentor has to have the ability to adapt in any situation and as soon as possible or immediately. So that's why I always called it a personalized meeting or personalized session. So it's not about how do I say it? It's not about having one set of frame that everything fits in it, or one set of box everything fits in it. I should have an adaptation. I should have a personalized mindsets, and as you said, Dawn, is mirroring, but also mirroring in the way that you observe. It's like a pinch bump or something like that. Like you really need to observe the heat, observe the water, observe everything, because the person who is coming to the session, he might have an expectation. And if you don't meet that expectation somehow, because of the communication styles and so on, that really might impact their own experience itself. So the communication at the end of the day, it will end up into an experience which might lead to your reputation somehow, or lead generation and so on. So that's why I always say is, I wrote it down so I don't forget, is which is a great point David said, is always clarify and ask questions. And I usually do or tell a couple of couple of profession and the corporate level, I said, in any argument or disagreement, convert that uh, argument or disagreement into a questionnaire. That's what happened. So at least for you to clarify more, you don't assume more. Then once you clarify more, you give a little bit of a relief to the other person. So you and them can come up in a midpoint.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, two great questions for that. As you say, David, is what do you mean by that? But also describe your definition of X, just so that you can get really clear around what the client's talking about. The flip side of that is if you don't, and somebody, says they're concerned and the coach says, what are you worried about or what are you anxious about? Even just slight changes in the words alters the meanings for the client. That potentially takes us back to webinar number 3, where it's damaging to the trust and the rapport building. What are some of the other consequences of not getting this right, do you think, David?
I think the first and foremost one is that the client can start to lose trust in the coach, because in some cases, the client might just continue the conversation and not be overly concerned about it. It depends upon what the topic is, but if a coach is dealing with a topic that is highly personal, highly charged, highly evocative, big issue, causing a lot of problems, and the client starts to pick up on the fact that the coach is using different language and they start to get frustrated, that lack of trust can have amazing repercussions on the coach-client relationship. And realistically, so when we go back to and sort of forgive me, Solly, for bringing contracting up again, but as you know, so it's one of my key issues, is that at that contracting stage, the coach really should be sort of like trying to understand, right, what is the language of the coach, the client, what is going on, and picking those things up. And they'll have started to build trust at that point. The other thing as well is that if the coach is using one sort of set of words, one form of language, and the client is using something else, then you could be having the same conversation at totally different cross purposes and neither really realizing where you're going with that. And if the client gets to the end of the session and doesn't feel as if something's happened, that there hasn't been some sort of step change of some description, then not only the trust, but the faith in the coaching process might also start to take a negative turn. And there's nothing wrong for coaches to just catch themselves as well, and if they suddenly think maybe I've gone wrong here, then just auto correct. So that apologies, I used angry before. When you use concerned, can I just go go back on that and clarify as you say, what you mean, your description of it, so that we're on on the same terms. Because a lot of the coach training sort of brings in things like using the mirroring, using the paraphrasing, using summarizing, and expressions such as what I'm hearing is. And one of the things to be mindful of in being overly mechanistic, by that I mean using terms such as what I'm hearing is, just because somebody says, oh, it's useful to say that, rather than just being natural, is to clarify with that statement. Okay, so so what I'm hearing is that you're saying that you're concerned, ... So as a result of that, what else is happening, so that it builds that bigger picture. If you haven't done that, then you haven't got that bigger picture to go to try and dig into later on or at some point what that underlying cause might be in the first place. So it has so it was a long-winded way of saying it has a massive effect if you get it wrong. And I'll share a recent example.
Please.
From a recent assessment, if you've got one of the assessors who is predominantly cognitive, main thinking style, so a lot of the wording in the responses will be I think, it's more facts, more data. And if you have a coach then asking about feelings, then the coach will respond by saying something along the lines of, the client will respond along the lines of, I think I feel. And if then, the coach who's going through the assessment just picks up on the, okay, so you feel this way. You go, well, no, that's not what I said. What I said was, I think I feel. You start to get to this incongruity between, you know, like what's going on. So it's really important to pick up on, yeah, not just so like the what I would call so like the big C words in terms of like the main part of communication. It's those little, you know, key words that they will come out with. You know, like, what is their, you know, from the modality, you know, what is their main modality? You know, do they, you know, like, are they visual? You know, like, are they kinesthetic? Are they auditory? You know, are they more, so like cognitive? So like, are they more feeling oriented? Are they more behavior oriented? And it's little nuances that you need to pick up on, you know, which totally aids the, you know, so like aids the communication process.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's something that as a mentor, I come across quite a lot with students. That seems to be a sticky point for them. It's almost like it's one of the last hardest bits to get in terms of being able to develop a deeper rapport. And I guess it comes with practice, but it makes the difference between a good coach and what is called a cookie cutter coach, where you're sticking to the top 50 questions your coach training provider gave you type of thing. You've got to be able to personalize them and start by recognizing what you are. Are you visual, kinesthetic, or auditory? Put that aside, change your language accordingly, and reflect back to the client that you're dealing with. What are your thoughts
Yeah, and I
on
think
that,
that's,
Fayad?
Sorry, David, you wanna just
no, Fahad, you go ahead. So like I'm renowned for talking overly much, so it'll be nice to allow somebody else.
I think David, you already covered most of the cases, so I don't have much to add. But as you said, I think clearly it's mentioned wrong communication will lead to a lot of negative impacts on you and on the client itself. And I remember in the beginning of our journey, I think this year on the accreditation, I think I saw one video that one of the clients were meeting one of the psychologists or a coach, I think. And instead of getting better, they went worse just because they don't remember exactly the incident or even the previous session. So yes, I think wrong session, wrong communication skills, using the wrong phrases or words, that will always lead to a negative impact, not only in the coach itself, and the coach and the client and on the industry itself. And I think this is one of the main, I think, challenges right now here we have is the industry itself, somehow it's suffering from a reputation because of the few who are misleading the audience or the society in terms of the name coach. So yes, we will have a lot of, there will be a lot of negative impact, not only losing clients, it's also losing the relationship with them, losing potential business from their side. It's also about, as Don mentioned also, the only way to get better is to practice. A practice also, if you don't have a client, you never practice. You will not have a chances to practice. At the same time, you should have the ability to learn something new. So that's what I feel. I feel a lot of people, they feel that they had 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 successful sessions. They don't upgrade themselves better. So they feel, for example, a lot of people, I'm sure, if they see, oh, direct communication topic, it's something we are aware of it, but they don't know maybe one sentence, one statement, one phase can change the whole life, you know, like the whole concept itself. Like, for example, while you are talking also, I'm just writing in notes because I had filled a couple of maybe half page of notes right now because I'm still learning. I want to learn. And every single thing has to get adapted within, I could say, the session itself. So anything wrong, it has to get adjusted immediately, not letting it go or let the session off without even rectifying it. So ask the question, do you mean that one? I apologize if I use that phrase, everything. So it's a combination. There will he have a huge impact if any word or communication went wrong. And by the way, communication, I think we did not went through the type of communication because we have verbal, we have visual, we have body language, we have eye language. you know, we have emotions and so on. So probably, hopefully, if you have a time, we could go through the whole.
Definitely we will. And internal communication, that dialogue that's going on within us as a coach while we're listening supposedly to our client. I mean, that's one of the reasons, Fayad, that we assess every single person within the IAPC&M, even if they've come through an organization that we've assessed their course, their training course, because otherwise it's like comparing apples with oranges. Everybody has to meet a certain standard. And that's why we also recommend that people have their own coach or supervisor or mentor. And it's one of the reasons that David's introduced supervisory support into the IAPC&M. So yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right with that. I think the third thing I would say, just talking about the IAPC&M, is that's why we're here for the lifelong journey of a coach. It's not just about attracting them as APCs, it's about supporting them with CPD and business development to see them go on to becoming a senior coach, a master coach, and eventually a fellow coach. So I certainly, as a customer facing person, pride myself on, you know, being there for their whole journey. Which brings me on to, funnily enough, I just wrote NVC, non-verbal communication. So intuition and internal dialogue, that's all part of it, isn't it, David?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was working with somebody recently. It's a supervisory capacity, and we were talking about, you know, sort of how self-talk, you know, can get in the way. And we also talked about, you know, how self-talk can, you know, sometimes challenge, you know, like intuition. And generally speaking, we talk to ourselves, you know, like in our own heads more than we talk to anybody else. And the way that works is remembering that if you've got sort of like this inner dialogue going on, whatever it is saying, you know, positively or negatively, unless you can just neutralize it and simply say, right, okay, so yeah, I understand that, but I'm going to find out myself. Then what you end up doing is sort of is being directed by that. So, you know, just going back to that example of, you know, like, what I'm concerned about, and your inner dialogue goes, oh, that sounds like it's going to have you like a massive implication on the rest of the person's life, which then leads to a question of, or a statement saying, you know, that, you know, like, that sounds really terrible. It must be having an impact on the rest of your life. And they go, not really. You know, it's, you know, just this issue really. That was also something that came out of a recent assessment. You know, very much a statement of, so this must be affecting all of your life. No, it's only affecting this part of it. So the intuition bit is great if it's right. If it's wrong, that's equally not a problem, because the way to look at it is, right, yeah, I checked something, I was wrong, therefore, you're like learning point for myself, but at least I know, you're like, where we're going now with this. And I think the other thing as well as the, you know, sort of the self-talk is that, and this sounds a bit sort of like a bit wacky, but if you have self-talk going on at the same time as you're in a coaching conversation with a client, there are now three of you, you're in that dialogue, and it's difficult to be able to do that. So you have to recognize that the inner dialogue you have with yourself, you know, maybe when a client's, you're like talking and you're listening, that dialogue is helping you to progress the coaching conversation. It's not getting in the way. Because if it is getting in the way, that's a conversation that you really need to have either with your own coach, your own mentor, or a supervisor around, yeah, I'm usually pretty good, but sometimes you're like, my inner dialogue so like runs away with me, and I tend to drift. So there is that, you know, like that absolute bit. I just want to, before I forget, there's an expression that I know that you've used, so like on a number of occasions, just, you know, picking up this whole thing about communication, which I hope it's not too much of a challenge for you to remember, which is the, I think you know what I said, but you didn't understand.
Yes. Yeah. I'll try and find it while we're talking. But yes, it's essentially what you think I said is not what you heard, because that's not what I said. It's that sort of quote. I'll put it in the blog,
exactly.
the exact quote. So it is a bit of a tongue twister. Yeah. So intuition, as you say, it doesn't matter if it's wrong, it's how you deal with it. And I think also how you present your intuition. So if you're kinesthetic, you would say something like, you know, I'm sensing that underneath this concern, there might be some overriding anger to deal with. How accurate is that? They say no, no harm done. If they say yes, spot on, and you can deal with that as well. So I think it doesn't matter if you've got it wrong, as long as you set it up correctly. If that makes sense. I hope it does make sense, because after all, we're talking about direct communication. So we should be clear and concise in our communication today.
Yeah, that would be useful, wouldn't it?
It would indeed. Fayad, what would you like to add to this?
I don't know why you were guys mentioning about the internal dialogue. I immediately recalled a couple of incidents while I was having group coaching or kind of one-to-one coaching. And I remember this one of the cases that I had last October 2019, where I was supposed to do a normal coaching session to one of my clients. And it turned out I don't know, something was, I asked a question, what they called it the deep question, where you want to really figure out what's going on. Immediately turned out into a drama situation. She started crying and she started remembering all these deep negative emotions or the causes and everything. And I immediately had started my own internal dialogue. I said, what's going on? I don't know how to mention, you know, it's for me, I don't want to say it's one of the first incident, but you know, yeah, when you have someone in front of you, a female is crying about something, and the solution is expected to be like a family counselor more than just a coach and everything. So you get stuck in between. I was asking myself a lot of questions. What did I did? How do I manage it? How the whole thing. But as you said, it's the way that how you deal with your internal dialogue. I did not let my internal dialogue distract me from the conversation, because I notice also sometimes between me and myself is when, for example, I'm listening to someone and at the same time I remember something or I forgot something, I do have the internal dialogue, and the internal dialogue sometimes is taking off the whole session in front of me. So even though for example, I'm listening to David, but practically nothing went into my head, you know, like is there some blockage in my ears? So I think the way that you control your internal dialogue, it's very important. And the only way to control it is that you have to be strong. That's mean your mind has to be more stronger than your heart itself to enable to control what's really I mean, to control, I mean, the flow of what is right, what is wrong, and how to manage it. So you don't let your emotion usually takes off your decisions or your actions. And I think with every message that you send, there is two components of it. There is the content and there's the feeling or the emotional part. That's why sometimes you might have one phrase, and what happened in that phrase is if you have two people, someone will take it logically based on the content, based on the subject, and you will see another individual that will be taking that message from an emotional point of view. And then obviously when taking the whole thing into the emotional point of view, then you will realize that the action and reaction of that of the whole conversation is drifting somewhere away. So yeah, I think internal dialogue is important, just to remind you about things that you don't know, and instead of saying to the client, okay, just a minute, let me write down a couple of notes. So you need to have that multi-skill, multitask skill, that you will be able to write a note, has a conversation, listen, not hearing, listening skills, blah blah, everything during the whole thing. And I know ladies and females, they are so super in the skills, but we guys are trying to catch up with it. I don't know, my wife is doing that freely, but I don't know myself, I'm still struggling with it.
Fancy you stereotypically female and male gender like that, but I think you're probably right. I was just reaching for my book there because I was on a CPD call the other day and somebody was talking about the coaching scenario or the topic or the issue as the context, and then all the questions and elements of what the coach does is the content. And I thought that was quite a useful way of thinking about it. So a top tip to minimize the sort of dialogue, the self-dialogue, because as David says, you're not listening if there's a third party in there, is come to the coaching call. And this takes practice and self-belief and confidence with just a blank piece of white paper. And that represents an open mind. It gives you the opportunity to listen. I know a lot of coaches surround themselves with notepads and yellow sticky posters with, questions, but that just means that you're not really listening and you're just waiting for an opportunity to ask the question that you want to ask. So that would be one tip that I would share with you. The other thing is after the call, and I know we do this in the assessment process, is ask everybody to do a self-reflection. Just a few minutes. It's part of your ongoing CPD. I've been coaching now for about 17, 18 years, maybe a bit longer. After every call, just take 5 minutes with yourself and write down what worked really well with that call. What could you have done better next time? And this is quite important, I think, because particularly for new coaches, they have this perception that us oldies who have been doing it, and I mean that in the sense of longevity, we've been doing it for a long time, we're perfect, and none of us are perfect. And I think when you get to the stage of thinking, oh, you're perfect, you could do this with your eyes closed, think about your shopping list and, all the rest of it, then you're not doing a good job. You have to stay very aware and centered and open to what the client is talking about. So doing a self-reflection after each and every call, make sure that you're right on track. And if you've missed something, you can bring it up in your next session. What would you add to that, David? Because I know the self-reflection forms are an important part of the accreditation process, aren't they?
Yeah, very much so. And I think the sort of reflecting before a call, and reflecting afterwards, is critically important. And once you get into the habit of doing it, it is that opportunity to think, right, okay, well, what went well, what didn't go so well, what would I do differently next time? What sort of questions did I ask? How did I respond? How was I feeling? Did it go the way that I thought it would do? And there's an opportunity within that to link anything that comes up into, right, not just what I'll do differently next time, but it links then to my own personal, ongoing continued professional development. Because I might get to a point and think, well, I'm asking some good questions, but I'm not necessarily asking great, clear and concise questions. So that's something that I'm going to go away and work on. And I'll only know that from reflection. And this is why it's important to be able to reflect after a coaching session and then sort of clear the decks, for want of a better description, before you work with another client, so that you're not carrying that that baggage across. And the process of reflection as well. So there are really two elements of it. There is the what you would call reflection in practice, which is that ability to reflect after the event. But there is also reflection in action, and that's a sort of a higher skill, which is you're in the moment, that you can catch yourself and sort of change course, for want of a better description. And then the final stage would be reflection for future action. And the thing to remember with that is that you never, even though you might say, right, I've got another session with this client, this is what I'm going to do differently next time. You can only do a certain percentage of that, because by the time next time comes, they've changed, they've got different, even if it's just a week, they've got a week's worth of lived experience. So the situation is never the same. As you said, the context might be much the same, but a lot can happen in that time span, which we sort of covered on the safeguarding webinar of, you never really know what's going on for a client until you actually ask them, what's going on for you today? How are you? But yes, I would agree. So like the reflection is a critical part.
And that practice, that best practice, would certainly help the coaches who we hear say, "I'm just not getting the results that I thought I would," or "My client is not getting the results." That would certainly help with that, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Fayad.
Yeah, I totally agree with you guys, and I think it's very important that everyone should at least seek once in a blue moon, could say, a coach or supervision or a feedback, especially the old experience coaches and mentors, because you might start practicing a couple of I could say sessions in the same way, and you don't see a result. So basically you're just turning around within your comfort zone itself. So it's good to have a little bit outsider thoughts in terms of what I'm doing, what do you think? And for me to do a self-reflection, I suggest if there are a couple of people are not so good on managing distraction. So what I would suggest is, for example, maybe you could have a maximum, a note, small note with a pen. Keep all these yellow pads, color pad in a way, and record the session if you feel that you can't manage the whole destruction part. Then when you are in a very easy, I could say, relaxed time, listen to it. And when you listen to it, don't listen to it as you are trying to ignore anything wrong. Try to be so neutral, and you need to criticize yourself in a positive manner. So then you see, as David said, it might be good, but it could be great, or it could be better somehow. So, and I think this is why I also always do. So even if I attend the conferences, when I attend the meetings or event, or I speak in an event, even doing an online course, I always record my session virtually and even voice, because sometimes maybe I don't have a time to watch it on the laptop. So while I'm running or doing some exercise or jogging, I could listen to it while I'm the podcast. So this is, at least it will give me a little bit, okay, I think I missed this point, or I was using little bit of a lot of ahs, or maybe I was supposed to do this and not this. But for you to accept all these self-criticism, sorry, and feedback from others, you should you should be at least balanced emotionally, mentally, I could say even from an experience point of view. You should always keep yourself that you are not the best. There always, I could say, a space for learning. So what I suggest is always listen to your stuff, record it, be positive when you criticize yourself. Um, and when it comes to the learning, I feel there is two or three sides of learning. There is immediate learning based on an immediate feedback, and there is, based on this learning, what is the short and long term impact on that person. And I think this is also part of the CPD, because in the CPD you should mention what exactly did you learn in that session, and how this session helped you to improve your future practices, knowledge, your business, even the coaching sessions itself. It's part of the CPD. So yeah, I think it's very important to look into it in a neutral way.
I mean, particularly for the coaches who are struggling and saying to their coach, mentor, supervisor, "I'm just not getting the results or the outcomes," then it leads back to session number 6, powerful questions. When they're doing that reflection, they could almost be thinking, well, what if I had asked this question instead? How do I think that might have helped move the client forward more? There's also a set of questions I came across the other day that somebody uses, and that's as part of the self-reflection. What happened? So you write that down or you say it. Why did it happen that way? Maybe it's because I asked that question or didn't ask that question. What worked particularly well with that client? What didn't work quite so well? What did I learn for next time? And I think that's just, it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It could be something as simple as that. But it's an important part of CPD.
Sorry, I just would like to add something. I just missed that point. The reason that you need to do self-reflection, what I feel, this is based on my own practice, is to not to repeat the same experience in the previous session. So this is what will make you kind of out of the routine practices. So, okay, I think I missed this one. So let me create a new culture, a new environment. Even the place that we meet, and it's not necessarily has to be the same place. We meet in a different place. Plus of that, the questions are different. Maybe I did not see the powerful questions session yet, but probably I'll go back to the archive and look into it. The I think number 6. So I will go to it and I will also educate myself about it. But it's also about having different styles of questions, different style of communication in every session. And the only way to know is you will be able to do a self-reflection, either you or someone else on behalf of you. That's only my contribution.
Mhm.
Over to you guys.
Thank you. So, David, as an assessor, what would be some of the things that you're looking for that demonstrate somebody doesn't have direct communication skills?
It would be first and foremost. Trying to say, I was going to say first and foremost, but there isn't a first and foremost. There's actually quite a lot of different things that come up in different ways. So so like in my attempt to be clear in my communication, I shall pause there so I can rephrase. One of the ones is not using the client's language. So not picking up on thinking, feeling, visual, auditory, kinesthetic. So that's one of the opening ones. The second one would be talking in such a way that is very long-winded, or questions are long, complicated, or they might be multiple. Another one would be using the coach's language, not the client's. So the client sits there and goes, right, yeah, that sounded like a really good question, but unfortunately I've got no idea what 4 or 5 of the words were that were in there. Can you explain what you mean? The other one would be any use of jargon, which is inappropriate. And I stress the word, so like jargon that's inappropriate, so specifically that the client doesn't understand. So if you were working, so like in a corporate environment, for example, and you're talking about a SWOT analysis, or you're talking about PEST or PESTLE, then it's likely, and I stress the word likely, that the people will understand what that is, but not necessarily. You know, there are plenty of people, so like who've come into different roles or different aspects of their life, quite happily oblivious to, you know, SWOT analysis and PESTLE. And it's the same with things like SMART objectives as well. Anytime we make that assumption that, okay, you like set yourself some objectives, you know, what would be a SMART objective? The assumption is that they know what that is. So that would be another one. And I think the final one, which links a little bit to what Fayed was saying about not just the types of communication, but the way we communicate, is that if the coach is nervous or apprehensive in either asking questions or dealing with the response from the questions, or is nervous, or like when they're providing challenge or feedback, then they are all of the things that start to pull away from the clear communication. If you can get through, so like the coaching assessment, and at no point the client has gone, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean, or could you rephrase the question multiple times, and I suppose so like the final one would be thinking about the 80-20 rule, that 80% of the conversation should come from the client, and the 20% should come from the coach. So thinking about the different time scales we've got for assessment at the practitioner level, you've got 30 minutes. This is where my maths is going to desperately fall down here, but so out of 30 minutes, if you're going to have 80% of that time with the client talking, that means that your communication needs to be absolutely spot on. Straight to the point. Get around to talking about the key points, and just letting the client talk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely keeping it simple and no multiple choice questions, because then the client doesn't know which one you want to answer first. So lots of good points there. Fayad, what, if anything, did you want to add?
Yeah, and I think I don't want to just hit back on the coaches in general, but probably you don't expect a new result if you don't implement a new way or a new approach. That's the whole thing. So if you're traveling from Dubai to, for example, to Europe by airplane, it will take 6 hours. Do you want to achieve in, let's assume 3 hours, then you need to jet. Or if you want to reach before the specific date, then you need to leave before. So the whole concept is about it. If you need different result, you need to change your approach. And I always think, for example, it's not about someone, it's not about the receiver, it's not about the client. It's always about us, that we need to try to adapt our way that we can make it easy to the clients. Because let's be honest, right now is the coach, the coachee, when they come, for example, for a session, obviously they will not be in somehow in a balanced emotion or mental physical maturity, I could say, in terms of they will come up with their own problems, they will come in a lot of things, small tiny simple question, they might not understand it, because right now their feelings or their emotion is taking care of their action and reaction. So what I feel is, I feel it's the coach responsibility to try to make somehow a balance, and at the same time has to simplify it in a way, or control the whole situation itself. So maybe sometimes, for example, the only way that I don't blame the coaches is when I know the client understood exactly what is the meaning of the questions or the session or the whole objective, but still they are not ready to co-op because it's either against their I could say their background, their education, their experience somehow, but they got the whole point. It's not they did not get it and trying to have an argument with you, no. So the only way I think is the coach responsibility is try to adapt with the whole situation. So one of the questions, like I feel, for example, obviously don't use some jargons, some inappropriate words, for example. And the reason that I always say, you should lower your language with till the level of your clients. But sometimes, let's I don't want to mention it that way, but sometimes the clients are too easy, that they use very social words, I mean social, even bad words and so on. So you don't get into that level. So still you need to maintain a specific red line at the minimum. So you don't use, for example, couple of words, couple of jargons, couple of phrases, just because your clients are using it, or from the hood, for example. You don't use all these stuff. So even though you're lowering your standard or language, I could say, but still it has its own um, standard or line itself. So it's always about the coach, because the coach is more experienced. So they need to control the whole situation. They need to adapt. They need to frame the whole scenario itself.
I think you've raised quite a few good points there, Fayad. It reminds me of my recruitment days when we were looking for staff. We knew that if they had the right attitude, we could train them in the skills. And what we're saying here with coaches is the questioning technique is pretty much the tool that coaches use. Everything else is very hard to train them in. Training in active listening, training in intuition, training in rapport, because if they haven't got the right attitude, none of that is going to come easy. So it's, you know, coaching isn't rocket science. I don't think anybody's ever claimed it, you know, has a high degree of intelligence required to it, but it has a high degree of empathy and all sorts of other sort of emotional intelligence type attributes. Coaching at the end of the day is a conversation, and you know, the quality of our life is based on the quality of our conversation. But these are things that you can't easily train, and that's why some people hold on to all their post-it notes of the top 50 questions and think that's it, I'm coaching. But you've just demonstrated it's so much more than that. It's about being a good facilitator. It's about being able to communicate and build rapport and reach somebody at their level. So thank you for that. Before I change the subject, what, if anything, would anybody else like to add to what we've just said?
think just going back on something that Fi had mentioned earlier on about the different types of communication, is that sort of, when we're listening, so like it's, as well as listening for words, you're also listening for the pace, the pitch, so like the tone that the client is using. And where it's all possible, so like especially if you've got, so like video conferencing, or if you're, face to face, then, body posture or body language and facial expressions, that's all an aspect of communication. So it's about, picking up on, like on all of those different aspects. So there's a lot going on. And the thing to remember is that, it's a two-way process. So, never forget that, although sort of we're talking about, the way that the coach communicates clearly, concisely, and effectively with the client, the coach's body language, their tone, their pace, their facial expressions also communicates something to the client, which should be very much about, look, I'm here to help you. But as you were rightly saying, both Dawn and Fayed, that there's only so much you can do, and there is that point of, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So you can have the best communication, and the most powerful questions, and great active listening, and emotional intelligence, skills, to the nth degree. But the client has to want to do, and is prepared to go out and do the things that are going to make a difference to their life. And the part of communication is the coach's ability to get into that and to challenge it, so that certainly at a follow-up session, if they turn around and say, okay, how did you get on with all of those action points? And they go, well, I haven't done any of them, or I haven't done many of them. That the coach is not frightened to have what I would call that conversation around, okay, so so tell me, what's going on here, and that is that is opening it up to remembering that you can have as many post-it notes around your desk as you want, and like a lot of people, I've been there and had them on the wall, and almost had them on the dog as it's been going past at some point. That you just have to sit back and say, look, in essence, I've made an offer of communication. Please, talk to me. Tell me what's going on. Tell me, how I can help.
And that's a very important topic, and one we've dedicated to session 11. And I've just noticed, I don't know whether the graphic, what makes a good coach, is over the Y, or whether the Y is missed off. But managing the process and accountability is key. So we've got a whole session on that. So thank you for that, David. Fayed, you brought up the NVC. What else would you like to include in that, please?
What I could say, coaches, they should consider themselves as a trainers, because using the trainer's approach or methodology. What I mean is that, for example, there are non-verbal communication, and there are verbal communication, and there are different type of communication. What I always try to emphasize in all these guys, and I'll always tell these, like, for example, because I do train the trainers. So I said, don't use the same approach with everyone. And this is the same thing with communication. So even if you are sharing an information, you have people who are visual. They will only learn if they see a presentation or they see a whiteboard session. Then you will have a verbal communication. You will have people who are strong in verbal. That's mean you don't need to explain any presentation to them or even a notebook. Only by talking on the phone, that's enough. Then you have a different type of people who are practical. They should live the moment in terms of practical, they should dirt their hands on it. Then they will learn. Then you have the fourth type of people, and unfortunately, I don't see a lot of people are talking about it. People who get the message from their feelings and emotions. I called it the hard part. So then what do you have here? You have a verbal, which is the voice. Then you have the eye. Then you have the heart. Then you have the skin. I divided the whole thing. So you have the skin because people need to touch stuff as a practical, as an experience. Then they need to listen to it. or they need to see it, or sometimes they need to feel it. There are things, for example, motivation and vision and successful and motivational speech and public speaking. Some of them you need to feel it. You need to imagine it somehow. So this is the same thing where I think a lot of coaches, they should not only emphasize in words. For example, they also need to use the proper body language in sharing their hands. Because what I notice is, unfortunately, in some coaches, because they are nervous, or maybe they get used to this kind of a body language, when they talk they always use their hands upside down, which makes little bit the client nervous, or they don't know exactly what to do. So okay, you could do a mixture. So use a voice, use something, you bring a notebook, for example, explain to them things they don't know, because you don't know. Like I will gonna talk about myself. I am more visual personality than just a verbal. So I learn more by visual, and I could at least use my visual in order to transform a couple of information to these guys. But I know a lot of people who are within my circle. They are very strong in verbal. They could finish whole training course, even get even a certification on the training course just by listening. For me, no way I will pass even 1 mark if I can't see the actual presentation for me. So it's a personality. So the same thing when you deliver a coaching session, part of the communication, there are certain ways people learn or change. So when they change, they could change visually, they could change emotionally, they could change practically. Like for example, you will go to people, why do we give them why do we agree in the first session for something, then we follow up in the second session? Because we should ask them to live and feel the agreeable objective or changes that we had agreed on. So they have to live in it. It's not about, yes, okay, I did it. It's about living that part. So I could say at the end of the day, just to summarize, sorry to making it too long, but it's using your verbal, your voice, using your eyes, using your skin, which is practical, then using your heart. So an effective coach who will be able to balance and try to shift based on the situation of the clients in front of them. So you don't use one medicine for all the illnesses and disease in the world. And for the same specific disease or illness, you don't use the same parameters of medicine, because then, for example, sugar plus pressure, it has a different type of or parameters or measure of the medicine. For example, pure sugar has something else, and so on, the whole point.
I would add to that, it's about energy as well, being aware of somebody's energy, right from saying to somebody when they start the call, how are you today? You don't want to ask, how are you? Because you might take up the whole session, but how are you today? Quick snapshot, listen for the energy. And that's where the direct communication starts. But I think you also raise another point, Fayad, that David, I'd like you to answer, please, is around culture. Obviously, we're the international authority for professional coaching and mentoring. So what about culture? How do you take that into context when you're assessing people, please?
Culture's a sort of a key element, because different countries will approach things in different ways. So some countries have more of a a laid back approach. So other countries are very much have a culture which is a little bit more dynamic, a little bit faster paced. The natural language is generally quicker. So from a communication point of view, one of the things that we need to take into consideration is things such as culture, but also within this, because culture is a big catch-all, but culture, age, gender, generally what's going on, for the person, anything from an economic or an environmental perspective. So all of these things become really important. So at the point of the contracting, it's having that conversation, meeting what I would call meeting the client on their own terms in their own space, to understand the little nuances of that. Now there's quite a lot of like written about, you know, like culture and so like in different, you know, like cultural nuances, but predominantly so like it's very much about listening, you know, so like listening and responding to the client, you know, in their own language, and not being frightened of that. And I think the other element that sort of like that goes with that, and it's a sort of cultural aspect, but also sort of like a sidebar. Without going into a lot of detail, so like many years ago, so like when I was doing something completely different, one of the programs that we ran within an organization that I worked for, so it was a sort of a counseling program, so counseling in the workplace. And one of the exercises we had in that was called a comfort matrix, which I desperately tried to find and have failed, so like on every occasion. But predominantly, it so like across the different axes, it had different types of people down to like, you know, like one axis, and then topics or, you know, like context across the other. So you might have so like male, female, then you might have so like a range of ages. You might have you know, like poor, homeless, people so like with HIV, so people with COVID-19 now, black minorities, so like ethnic, refugees, you know, like and so on and so on and so forth. And then across the top, you saw like you had the different topics around you know, so like money, finances, health, welfare, so like gay rights, you know, like et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And what you did on the matrix was you simply identified, you know, what are the topics that you are comfortable, I mean, like 100% comfortable talking to somebody about, and what are the areas that you would find yourself thinking, you know what, I would find that conversation with that person difficult. And the whole idea of it was to bring so like a higher level of awareness of, right, that, you know, there are certain topics with certain people that I might not be as comfortable talking about as I might be so like with others. And therefore the consideration is, you know, when we're working with clients, is there anything that that client is going to bring up that we internally so like might feel a little bit uncomfortable with? And if it is, then we need to be aware of sort of how to deal with that. And the link to the culture is simply that there are different cultural nuances that, you know, some people might look at and go, well, there are certain things that happen in this country that I don't necessarily, you know, like agree with. That's absolutely fine. You're like, that's all about personal choice. But when you're working with the client, you either have to make a decision and say, right, I can work with this client because, you know, I am very neutral, I'm non-judgmental, I can separate things out and just work, you know, on a one-to-one basis, one-to-group basis. Or if it's going to get in the way, as a professional coach, you simply say, you know what, I'm unable to work with this, you know, with this person for, you know, my own reasons. And that so like is, you know, is one of the key things about being, you know, like overly professional.
Great. So everything comes back to the coaching agreement or contracting stage, literally, doesn't it?
It is a little bit like all roads lead to Rome. Yeah, it's the contracting piece, but also, you know, as a sort of like a colleague of mine is fond of saying, nobody knows what it's like to live in your skin. So only you know what you're comfortable talking to people about and less comfortable. It's that, you know, if we think about our own sort of personal relationships, you're like, and, you know, things that go in, you know, outside of this, so like the coaching context, we can all think of something of, you're like, you know what, that was a bit of a prickly or a difficult conversation. And we just need to be aware of that when we're working with clients, that, you know, like the same thing can happen. And although we might think that we don't respond to it on a sort of like an unconscious level, you know, and, you know, possibly with some cognitive bias, you know, we will respond to it. So this then comes back to, as Fahad was saying, like the importance of reflection, the importance of, right, okay, you know, like what was going on for me, because that helps us just generally to be a better, you know, a better coach.
So self-awareness of your triggers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, these sessions, these roundtable discussions just fly by. So we're coming to that time again. So just by way of a quick summary, what we mean by direct communication is it's appropriate, it's clean, it's clear and concise. Got to keep it simple, no jargon, and that we're able to confidently give challenging feedback. No multiple choice questions, because we want the client to be able to respond to the first question quite easily. What, if anything, have I missed, David, by way of a summary?
Nothing that I can think of. If I was going to sort of summarize it, I would say your role as a coach is to have the conversation with the client that matters, that makes a difference to them, that at the end of the session, they are further forward than they were before you started.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. And
there is that old adage of practical simplicity, immeasurable results. So, keep it simple.
Yeah.
Now I'll allow anybody else to just add their own S at the end of it.
Okay. Fayad?
Yeah, I could just summarize the whole thing. It does not matter what you do, it's how do you do it.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you do it? It's purely limited based on your imagination and based on what exactly you are looking for. So even though we have all the molds as a coaching, you have, okay, there are the molds, clear, simple. Well, what you will fill in these molds, for example, it's purely up to you. So it's not about what you do, because every coach, I'm sure, from an associate till a fellow, even till whatever, more than fellow, they know exactly what are the basics, a foundation of the coaching. But what to include within that basics as a mold, as a cake mold, as ice cream mold, it's purely based on your experience and your imagination and the situation, and based on your adaptation and the culture fit. Things that might fit in the Middle East should not, it can maybe or may not fit in, for example, in Southeast Asia, and so on. So there's no I could say how to do it. It's purely based on imagination, as much you don't cross the lines.
Thank you. So 2 things before we say goodbye. The first thing is the previous calls can all be found on the blog. They are always advertised in advance through the weekly bulletin. If anybody is not getting the weekly bulletin, you are missing out on a massive return on investment, because that is where we promote all the CPD and business building webinars, solution partner discounts, and so on. So if you're not getting the weekly bulletin, shout out. Secondly, if you do ever miss an opportunity to join a call live, you don't need to miss an opportunity to learn, because it's all recorded and uploaded onto our blog. So the previous session on powerful questions lists the previous ones. So you only have to find one of those emails and they're all previously listed. Second thing to mention is 21st of August, we will be discussing how to create awareness through feedback and challenge, which is obviously another form of direct communication. So see how they're all linked? So that's it. Thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you very much for joining us, Fayad, and giving us a truly international flavor today. Thank you, David. And any questions from anybody, please, you know who we are, where we are. We have an open door policy. We love to network with you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Bye-bye.